Hi, everybody. This is Megan.
And this is Steven.
And this is the Synchrony Podcast, where we talk about transforming apostolic dating culture and ending loneliness in the church. And yeah, happy Saturday.
Happy Saturday. We're recording on a Saturday in the middle of the day.
Yep. Shout out to my mother-in-law.
That's right.
Who has our children.
Emmy.
Yeah. We love her for that. I've been super jazzed about this episode since yesterday.
Yeah.
And we're not running on a ton of energy, but I'm still pretty pumped about it. So I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, I had to try to get you to stop talking about it so we didn't lose all of our podcasting mojo.
Yeah. Steven has to if I start getting excited about a topic, he's like, save it for the podcast. So hopefully we saved some of it for the podcast. I
sure we did.
I think we should just save announcements for the end. Well, actually, the only one I'll mention is that our summer sale is coming up.
Yep. Summer sale. 40% off.
40% off Memorial Weekend. So it starts the 23rd, runs through the 26th of May. And we'll have information about the discount codes and links to get you to the shopping cart with that discount on our social media. So follow us on Instagram and Facebook if you don't already, to make sure you see that when it first comes out.
That's right. Save it up. Save the date to get your consultation.
Yeah. And reminder too, it's great to have it at that discounted price. Even with the discount, you can still choose to use Klarna or Afterpay if you wanted to space out the amount of time that you pay that fee.
And Klarna and Afterpay breaks up the consultation fee into 4 separate payments over 4 months.
Yep.
So you don't have to worry about that all hitting your bank account at once.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to tell the background of this. This is sort of a continuation of last week in the sense that this topic came out of the discussions following our episode about Mr. Darcy. So we did an episode last week about Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen, and how the sort of archetype of the male character set up in that novel have influenced mostly women in the apostolic church to a significant degree in terms of how they think about their potential partners. Somebody on Instagram asked me the question, what is the male equivalent of this archetype? And they didn't mean like what's a woman who's like Mr. Darcy.
Yeah.
They meant, what is the problematic archetype that men gravitate toward that exists in society?
Yeah. Which kind of started this rabbit hole for you.
I went down a complete nerd rabbit hole, which I will try to just skim the surface of today, because I think I got way too deep into a bunch of different stuff that impacts this. But we're going to frame this around the concept of the girl next door.
Yep. And I even remember either a comment or a response to one of our stories about the girl next door being one of the common tropes for men. So
I imagine most people have probably heard this phrase, but for anyone who hasn't, what's your take on what the girl next door sort of means? Like, how would you define that?
It's a person that you're close to, that you're familiar with, you probably were raised with, that is probably someone you would like to date, and maybe you're friend zoned, or it's something that you're always longing for, basically.
Yeah, there's this kind of like romantic Americana idea of a childhood romance, someone who comes into your life when you're young, that you grow up around, like you said, who is familiar, right? And oftentimes in sort of when people tell like girl next door stories, or when that trope comes into play in like literature and media, there's a period of time where one member of that pair has feelings for the other that may not be reciprocated, and that might switch over time, right? But the idea is that eventually the girl next door ends up becoming the wife that you want. And usually this connotes a sort of like wholesome, down to earthness. Like, the girl next door is not a bad girl stereotype. She's more like, I think there's been times where it's been sort of twisted that way.
I would say I'm pretty sure there's been iterations of it that are like, your best friend's hot sister,
There,
girl
well,
next door.
there was a movie, I found this in researching it, did not watch the movie, that came out I think in like the 80s or something, maybe later, where it was a spoof on the idea of the girl next door, and the girl who moved in next door was a former porn star.
Oh
So
gosh.
it was like a complete inversion of
Yeah.
that, right? But ideally, the girl next door is meant to be this sort of like familiar, wholesome, person that understands you for exactly who you are and accepts you for who you are, loves you for who you are because they've known you for so long. Why is that idea attractive to men? And I know you don't speak for all men, but I'm just sort of like asking you to guess based on what we've talked about and who you've interacted with.
I mean, from what I can imagine, it's probably the familiarity aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's someone who already knows you for who you are, most likely. Someone that you're comfortable being around, someone you see often. It's not, maybe you also know them and know their character. And this is like completely on like the hopes that it's like not just attraction based, like if you actually know the person.
There is sort of a baked in assumption in the girl next door trope, though, that she's gorgeous.
Yes, usually. But yeah, it's someone that you see on a regular basis that you're comfortable with, or maybe not in the sense of like how to always act around this person, but because of the close proximity, it feels natural. It feels
You don't have
like,
to mask around this person.
Exactly.
Which is interesting because I think, it's funny when I talk to women about what they're looking for in a potential partner, that ability to be unmasked is very much at the forefront, right? Like we want someone that we feel completely ourselves with, can totally let our guard down. But I think the media that's really driven at women doesn't follow that same trope as much, right? The mysterious stranger is much more I think the focus of female driven media and literature and that kind of a thing. So this idea that men find this very familiar individual who in some ways I imagine feels very emotionally safe is interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting to me because we talked about some of this in our episode, a couple episodes ago, about like, are the guys okay, right?
Yeah.
That in our society today, men are under a tremendous amount of pressure to perform at the highest level of career achievement, physical capabilities, conventional American masculinity. And the idea that you have this person who has seen all versions of you and accepts you must feel really attractive in contrast to that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Very different to what we're selling women as a culture.
Oh, for sure. I think it's kind of funny that it's opposite of each other.
Yeah. So we talked last week about the trope of like the woman who encounters a sort of mysterious and maybe slightly monstrous man and brings out his humanity.
Yeah. It's the Beauty and the Beast. It's the war veteran, like the
Yeah,
hardened, yeah,
right,
like the super trauma.
right, hardened, rugged man meets beautiful, tender woman, and she, she's totally normal, but something about her is special, and she changes him. Like that's I think what women see all the time. So women are often sold a narrative of a woman's capability to change a man, and this is like where all the monster romances come from, the vampire dramas, the whole thing,
Sure.
right? In contrast, we see this trope with men where it's attractive to have someone who requires no change.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
What do you mean? Like,
I guess, and this, I'm not trying to make this a loaded question. I'm genuinely curious. Like, do you think that's like a healthy sort of thing to seek out, like a partner who has no expectations of change from you?
oh, sure. I mean, that's the easy, natural, smooth going relationship that requires no change is less effort.
Yeah.
And think about it this way, like going back to what we talked about how men, generally speaking, are not trained by other men on how to emotionally like be, I don't want to say be competent. That's kind of being mean.
Emotionally literate.
Yeah. In the sense of like how to suss out your emotions, how to break them down, how to have a conversation about them. in a deep way, and that's men and women communicate differently. But look at it from that aspect of finding someone that doesn't require them to have to go any deeper than they already have been taught how to go.
Yeah.
You know, and be able to find someone who already completely understands them and accepts them for exactly who they are.
Yeah.
You know, it's comfortable.
It also doesn't require, and like for what it's worth, like I think the idea of having a long-standing friendship that eventually becomes a relationship is really beautiful.
Yeah.
Like I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's something that when it happens is great, right?
Yeah.
But I also think that part of this fantasy is that he doesn't have to make any effort to go seek her out.
Yeah.
She's right there.
Yep.
And, you know, yes, there is usually this sort of question of like, is it worth ruining this friendship and maybe losing my access to this person by creating a romantic relationship, right? That's usually a tension in these like girl next door type situations. But generally speaking, like there's no barriers to connecting with this person. You grew up next door, right?
Yeah.
Like you're probably used to family dinners together or barbecues together or whatever. Like you've always had access to this person's life in a way that's very hard to get in a dating space where we now require men, and I think apostolic women want an even higher level of initiative from men than maybe women in the world do, right? Because we have the whole like pursuit idea.
Yeah.
I think that makes that idea of like a person who's just sort of like ready to initiate a relationship with no need to pursue them really.
Yeah.
In order to have them is really interesting and attractive to me.
Okay. Why?
Like, I mean, not attractive to me as a person, but it's interesting to me as like why I would see men gravitate toward that.
Yeah. Why? What's your breakdown of why you think that?
I think it says that I think it's another indicator that our expectations for men are sometimes unrealistically high. And there are parts of this trope that I don't think are healthy, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. Like, I think the origins of this come from a place that's not realistic, and that ultimately the girl next door is usually still an unrealistic experience for most people.
Yeah.
But I can understand why it would be so relieving to have the ability to connect with someone authentically and vulnerably who does not need to go through all the rigmarole of getting to know you.
Yeah.
Right. And women love the rigmarole. Like when we're reading our novels, we like the courtship phase, the tension, all of that. But all of the pressure to move it forward is on the male usually. Yeah. And so I can see why men would go like, man, isn't it great to have this beautiful woman who accepts me for who I am and doesn't need me to be anything that I'm not, who I also have right here, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, so I do want to talk though about this nerd rabbit hole that I went down a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So I started to kind of ask, like, where did this idea of the girl next door come from, right? Did it come from a particular book or movie? Like, when did it show up? And there's a lot of debate about this. There's no one clear place that it sort of arose, right?
Sure.
But one place where it was very prominent and very kind of like evident was in one particular form of media that has been around since the 1930s. Are you familiar with Archie comics?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Not like I didn't read them avidly, but I'm familiar with them.
Okay, so for those of you who aren't, Archie comics is a comic. It's both a comic book and they ran it as a syndicated comic strip in newspapers starting in the early 1930s. And I think they still print them today. I mean, you could go get the little comic books at the grocery store checkout line when I was a kid, and I would buy them and read them.
Yeah,
right?
I remember them.
So they're these, small comic books. They've basically gone through tons and tons of iteration over the years. They even took the kind of premise and spun it up into a TV show, I think called Riverdale. I haven't watched it. So Archie comics are developed by this man named John Goldwater, and I'm going to talk a bit about him in a minute because he's kind of an interesting character here, along with a cartoonist named Bob Montana, and they're the sort of founders of this. And they develop this set of characters when Goldwater's in his early 30s, right? But he's going to become a very prominent figure in American comics and comic book printing.
Okay.
So comic books started in the US in like what, the early 30s or late 20s?
I believe Superman was somewhere like 35, 36, 37, somewhere around there.
Yeah, they kind of all start to emerge in the same era,
And there were
right?
other like smaller comic books before that, but
And yeah, there were precursors to this. Like, they say that the first sort of collection of comics came out in like right after the turn of the century, even like the late 1800s. But it wasn't a comic series, right? Where you had a
Yeah.
character that you followed through. These hero comics start to emerge in the 30s and take off. And this is a really weird time in American culture,
yeah,
right?
it's in between the two world wars.
Right. In between the world wars, we're in the middle of the the depression, right? We'd come out of the roaring 20s, gone into the Great Depression. And these kind of larger than life characters start to come into play. Archie is sort of the other side of that, right? Archie is supposed to be kind of an everyman character. He's supposed to be a high school student. He's red hair, freckle faced, kind of like goofy,
Yeah.
right?
The average Joe.
Average Joe living in normal America, right? He's meant to sort of represent Americana. So he's not Superman. He's sort of the anti-Superman in the sense that he's as normal can be.
Yeah.
But the one thing that's really interesting about Archie's life is that he has two women in his life. And there is this love triangle, and this trope lasts throughout the entire Archie franchise from when it started in the 30s up until its present iterations, right? The two women in his life are Betty Cooper, who is the quintessential girl next door,
Yeah.
and is labeled as the girl next door throughout these comics, right? And Veronica, whose last name escapes me right now. Betty and Veronica are best friends and also romantic rivals, in that both of them have a crush on Archie. And Archie, a big theme of these comics is that Archie never really finds true love. He's always in between Betty or Veronica, right? And he could kind of see himself with either of them. He's constantly, pursuing one at the expense of his relationship with the other and then switching.
Yeah.
The girls are always tricking each other into spending more time with Archie. So there's this love triangle that just persists throughout the whole thing. So Betty Cooper is the girl next door. She is wholesome. She's blonde haired, blue eyed, sporty. She's the kind of person that would run a charity auction, babysit your kids, just sweet, down home, normal American girl.
Yeah.
Veronica is sort of the femme fatale of this comic series. She is wealthy. She's a brunette. She's very fashionable, very chic, and a little bit more, I would say, emotionally spicy, right? So they're a contrast to each other.
Yeah.
There's a suggestion that this whole idea of the girl next door sort of originated with this idea of who Betty Cooper was, because this becomes a massive part of Americana in this time. And these comics are insanely popular to the point where John Goldwater ends up becoming a really key figure in the American comic scene. So he actually becomes the key proponent, and I think also the sort of executive head of the Comics Code Authority, which becomes this censorship bureau that screens comics.
Yeah, they basically say like what can and can't be released in comics during those times.
Right. And they had a big hand in sort of curating the type of comics that were prevalent in American society at that time. Now, comics and comic readership, obviously lots of different kinds of people have read comics historically, but they have always targeted men as a key audience. I would argue that Archie Comics also has a pretty heavy leaning female component. Like there are some lines of it that were very clearly directed at women.
I mean, probably now. Do you think that was more men in the original? Wow. More men originally?
And the original, I think it was really still targeted toward men.
Yeah.
And there's this whole history of literature that was targeted at young men in particular that developed in the late 1800s or middle to late 1800s in both the US and Europe. This is a whole separate literary history rabbit hole that we don't have time for. But comics, there's a theory that it sort of evolved out of the idea of penny dreadfuls, which are these like cheaply printed serial stories that would just be kind of sold in chapter by chapter chunks. that young men who were working in difficult, laborious jobs would purchase, and that was sort of entertainment that they could easily pass among themselves.
Or out at war.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so comics have traditionally targeted the interests of men. They've been marketed heavily toward men, especially young men and boys, right?
Yeah.
The superhero comics are certainly indicators of that.
Sure.
So Goldwater is a key figure in this business of printing and marketing these comics, and he has a really heavy say in what can and can't be printed in comics. He brands his own comics, Archie Comics, which he made gajillions of dollars on because of how
sure.
popular it was.
I mean,
right.
if it's still around 90 years later, then yeah.
Right. He brands it as wholesome, as uniquely American, very down to earth, very appropriate for teenage audiences. Okay. And remember, he is the head of the thing that says what's okay and not okay to be printed in comics.
Yeah.
Okay. I am just going to quickly show you a couple of pictures from the original Archie comics series.
Yep.
Okay. And if you guys want to go look this up, you can. I'm not going to post the pictures that I'm showing Steven necessarily up there because you might not want to. There's nothing dirty about them, but just use your best judgment. Okay, so this is an example from 1951. So not necessarily super early, but this is an example from the 50s. Okay.
Okay.
So take a look there. I'm going to go back a little farther. So this is a very early example. This is one of the Archie's Girls sort of tracks. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So just with a couple of these examples, what are you noticing about how these women, Betty and Veronica, are portrayed in these comics?
They're definitely what I would consider to be modest in terms of like their apparel. They're not showing much skin.
That changes over the course
I'm sure
of the
over
comics.
time it does. I mean, it was the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, so they probably couldn't get away with much. But they're definitely certain body parts that are accentuated.
Right. They're still very sexualized.
Yeah.
And they're supposed to be high schoolers.
Yeah.
Right. And they look like pinup girls.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, were evolving at the same time and becoming very popular, right? These kind of iconic sort of fashion drawings of women with accentation and all the different places where a man might want a woman's body to be accentuated.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, Goldwater has drawn some critique because he created a separate comic line that didn't get as popular. That was a very, I would say, lightly masked pinup series.
Okay.
Right. So again, Goldwater and his company are marketing these comics as wholesome Americana directed at teens, healthy, right, positive, screened heavily.
Yeah.
But the depictions of these women are heavily sexualized. Heavily.
Yeah.
They do not have the bodies of high school girls.
No.
They have the bodies of Playboy bunnies to a degree.
Basically.
And as the comics evolve, if you go and look, and I'm not recommending this, if you go look at the evolution, it does get worse over time as culture changes, right?
It becomes less taboo.
Right. When I was reading them when I was younger, like, I wouldn't describe those as healthy images. I wouldn't suggest that my daughter should read them at this point.
Yeah.
Right. Or as a child. So this idea of the girl next door, if we take Betty Cooper as sort of maybe one of the key influences of this, Betty Cooper is a bombshell who happens to live, in proximity to Archie.
Yep.
But he never falls for her totally. He never runs off into the sunset with her. He's always torn between her and this sort of more chic and spicy female, right? And this love triangle goes on and on and on and on and on. And that's their whole story. Goldwater actually said that this was inspired by a personal experience of his.
Yeah.
So
do you have a way of telling that experience?
So what he says is like the origin story of this is that he, spent some time kind of like hitchhiking. And at one point was on a ferry and came across two young women who were on their way to join the novitiate, which means they were on their way to become nuns. and both of them fell in love with him, and it inspired these two characters, right? Which frankly, I find a little bit difficult to believe that
Yeah.
like, I mean, I guess it could happen, but you're on a ferry and you happen to make two nuns fall in love with you while you cross a river, apparently. It just feels a little bit too,
Oh, sure.
it feels a little bit too male fantasy. And so who knows how it happened, but he says that this was based off of real life events. Regardless, this idea of the girl next door and these early comic influences start to feed heavily into the media that gets targeted at men even to the present day.
Yeah.
So we got Archie comics that are running here. We also have superhero comics. Who are the main female characters in like those early superhero comics?
Well, main superheroes or
Not necessarily. I'm thinking of more like the female accessories to the male superheroes,
I mean, the Lois Lane.
who also came up in our Instagram stories, by the way.
Yeah,
as
sure.
like a suggestion of sort of the key
And she
female
was never
archetype.
like helpless in the sense of like, well, she was helpless at some points.
Yeah,
But she was always like also like strong, determined, independent, like, but she can't face up to other supervillains, right? So
right. She's
a
determined and
person-
independent, but she still needs a bigger, stronger, more powerful man to come
Yeah.
help her.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, Lois Lane is a good one, right? We have other women in comics who are sort of beautiful and dangerous. Again, kind of the femme fatale idea.
Oh yeah, like
right?
the Poison Ivies, the Catwomans,
Right.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay. And so, and I think it goes without saying, like, you probably don't have to Google this to know that women in these comics are also heavily sexualized.
Yeah.
Like, over exaggerated, completely unrealistic body images, as men are too.
Which is funny you say that because even the making of the comic, like the MCU movies, a lot of the female actors who have to like get into some of these outfits
Yeah.
that are not realistic to what like they're actually portraying in the movie, like some sort of assassin or some sort of like superhero that has to be able to be agile, but they're in like 1 millimeter inch or 1 millimeter thick leather. Like
Right.
it's there's been some complaints about being over sexualized even in the movies today.
Yeah.
But it's always been that kind of trope. No matter who you're talking about, like you have the Wonder Womans, you have the
Right.
Supergirl. Even in the cartoons, like they always were like
Yeah.
big chested women and stuff like that. So
Yeah. So you have these hypersexualized female characters who play accessory to these superhuman males,
yeah,
right? Generally speaking. And I understand that there's other characters that are more complicated and deep, and I'm not here to like get into the weeds of the canon, right? And I'm also not saying that
and not all of them would consider themselves accessories.
That's true. That's true. There are some main character ladies in comics. I'm also not here to suggest that comics are inherently bad or
Yeah.
wrong or unhealthy or unchristian or any of that. I'm not telling everyone to go start protesting comic book stores, right? It's fine. My point, though, is that in this period of time where American society is going through a lot of change, we're going from World War I, Roaring 20s, Great Depression, World War II, the baby boom of the 1950s, and the beginning of American sort of like Americana golden age, right? All of that's happening within a couple of generations. And what is being targeted at men are these ideals of these girls next door, these femme fatale sort of superhero women, or these kind of women who are accessories to powerful men, all of whom have been hypersexualized and oversexualized. Not to mention that in 1953, we see the advent of Playboy magazine and, printed pornographic material.
That's not the first time pornographic material has been
not at all
like mass produced.
Not at all. But the popularity and notoriety of that and how much of a household name it kind of became weirdly
Made it became a name brand.
Yeah, made it stand out, right? Yeah. And the unique aesthetic associated with that. And so all of these things are sort of happening targeted toward men. And I would argue that we see those influences in things that developed like, early superhero movies, right? Old Wonder Woman, old Superman movies, I would say played into those tropes. They were respecting the comic origins that they came from.
I haven't seen a lot of the older ones, so I can't really say.
If you go back and look at some of like the outfits and the costuming and everything, I would say it would map, right? You know, and that's evolved into like more modern comics. I think it's moved into video games. You didn't, correct me if I'm wrong. You're a bit of a comic nerd, but you didn't read a lot of physical comics. Is that true?
I got into, not like, I didn't have the physical books because
Yeah.
during my time, like I was raised in the 90s, in the 2000s, like I was a teenager in the 2000s. And so like I had a way of getting digital stuff, but my mom wouldn't buy me the physical copies for not
Yeah.
any other reason other than she didn't want to spend money.
Right.
But as they like became more on like TV shows and movies, I became more fascinated with it, which then made me do more research with the internet on knowing the backstories of all the different comic book characters and villains and stuff.
Yeah. So nowadays you can have someone who becomes a real like comic aficionado without having to go through the actual comic books,
Yeah.
right? Like
I think you'd have to be like a kid or a teenager in the 80s
to
to
be
really 80s or like late 70s, or I guess 70s and 80s was probably when it was probably the prime time to like have have magazines.
sure. And now we have, you know, obviously a lot of movies around the same themes that I
I'm
think
sure 90s too, but anyways.
right. Movies that I think are they all audiences have seen, I think, the MCU movies, but I think they market toward men, right? I think that, you know, we have games that come out of this. We have just a lot of spin-offs that have come from these core influences
Oh,
that
sure.
showed up in this early 20th century period of mass-produced, rapidly developed comic art,
Yeah.
right? Nothing against it. But let's just say that this whole idea of the girl next door has at least some of its origins in this idea of what a woman should look like and how you should interact with her. Because part of the thing about the girl next door is she's always slightly out of reach, either because the guy doesn't want to pursue her and doesn't really see her for who she is, right? Or because she's not interested in him, or because they're too close for it to be a relationship and they don't want to disturb their friendship, right? Or their like pseudo siblinghood sometimes. And so like the girl next door doesn't always have a happy ending. Like that's not necessarily a trope where the guy gets the girl and they settle down and have kids sometimes.
Yeah. Sometimes.
But I just want to kind of bring that up as like, do you think that men who kind of idealize this girl next door, like, how do you feel like this idea is influencing their expectations of women?
I would have to say that one, comic books, movies, stuff like that really sets a standard like that is an unrealistic expectation of like physical standards, especially for women.
Yeah.
They always portray them as the superheroes that can somehow always have their makeup perfect, right? And their hair is always in the right way, and they're always impeccably thin, while also being incredibly strong, right?
Right. And weirdly voluptuous.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that, but there's also, it's more about like, it doesn't talk about how these people get the women other than them just being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, there's not a lot of wooing.
No, it's more about like, yes, we both have the same goal. Let's do that together. Oh, we both do the same goal well together. Oh, let's get married.
Yeah, it's more like,
Like,
they're almost like comrades in arms
Yeah.
that become lovers versus like,
but
or
the thing is, a common theme in comic books too is also, if we want to go with that girl next door theme, a lot of the men in comic books, a lot of like the love struggle comes with this, like they want to be together, but they never really end up fully being together.
yeah, there's like that.
And there's usually some sort of heroic sacrifice involved, or
Right.
like, I don't want to
Unrequited
put
love.
you or your family in danger,
Right.
or secret identities or whatever. But like, there's some sort of trope of like they try it out and then they end up not staying together,
Right. It doesn't-
because the betterment of people, like
Yeah.
there's always some reason that they really don't stay together. The only time that I think, I mean, there's always breakoffs of different stories of them actually living happily ever after. But like Superman and Lois Lane
Right.
is a big one. There's other ones too, but that's like probably the most commonly known.
Yeah. So I guess,
parallel.
I mean, if I can extrapolate from what you're saying, like these aren't templates for actual real relationships. Like you've got unrealistic body standards. And I would say the unrealistic standards apply to the males and the females in comic
Oh,
books.
sure.
Like,
Yeah.
you know, men don't look like that normally.
Yeah.
The wingspan to waist ratio is ridiculous.
Oh, yeah.
But like,
And most of them are aliens
yeah,
that
so
that look like humans.
right, it's kind of weird. So like, you know, there's that whole idea that like the bodies that are being portrayed as goals are just completely outside of what is physically feasibly possible.
Yeah.
And I love that actually some of the MCU actors who had to portray these come out and talk about how insanely unhealthy they had to get in order to put themselves in a physical state where they could represent these characters.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah.
But
like, I hate chicken and rice now.
yeah, I mean like like I think somebody, I forget who it was, I forget which one, had like kidney issues, like had to go
Yeah.
get treated, you know, because of just like and they might have gone into like ketoacidosis or something.
Yeah.
But so like there's that whole part of it, but then also there's this idea that like there's never a real authentic connection based on their values. Either it's like this girl grew up next door to me and I love her because she is familiar and normal and sees me for who I am and I don't have to work toward that in any way. Or it's, you know, like you said, like we're joining forces.
We're fighting the same enemy.
Right. We're joining forces
Yeah.
to stop, you know, the Third Reich or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
so it's neither of those is a great template for how to connect with women.
No. It's a good tragedy in a storyline, but
Yeah.
it's not realistic to life.
Right. So I find this concept really interesting. And I've been thinking a lot about media and how, like, you know, last week when we talked about, whatchamacallit, Regency novels and how those have been really targeted at women and how apostolic women gravitate toward those because of the wholesomeness of it. Right. I think that there's a similar vein of that where you can be an apostolic guy and be really into like the classic Americana of superhero comics and again, like I don't think any of these are bad.
Yeah, the thing is I think most of the people that have these ideals or that have these mindsets about who they want to marry, I don't think there's that many of them that are avid comic book readers.
Probably not.
I think it's become so saturated in the market that it's become subconscious.
That's
It's
the
not like
thing.
these are people like going, "Oh yes, I want to marry someone who looks like Wonder Woman."
No.
It's or even going back to Betty Cooper, right?
Right.
It's like I don't know the last person I've talked to that has actually read an Archie comic.
Sure.
Right?
And I don't think most guys would know who Betty Cooper was.
No, but if you go back 3 generations where our grandfathers
Right.
grew up reading it, you know, when they're in their 30s, you know, like
It's in the water and the air.
that's the thing. It's been around for so long that it's become a cultural expectation.
Right. If you just think about the massive amount of time and marketing that came from Pep Comics, which later became Archie Comics, right? DC and Marvel and Playboy. Like if you just think about the amount of targeted marketing toward young men in America from the 50s to now, from those 3 places, and how big those influences have been in movies, in media, in art. Like, again, like I think you're totally right. I don't think that men are going and seeking out these Wonder Woman like templates, but I do think that it's just part of our idea that there could be a girl next door who looks like she stepped out of a magazine, right? And at the same time, there could be a femme fatale up the road, and you know what I mean? Like,
Well, here's the thing: is like it's been around for so long now that I think people that are creating content and creating movies don't even realize that that's where they're getting their influence from.
maybe.
So what I mean is like people who are creating sitcoms, people who are creating movies, people who are creating the average TV shows or whoever, or books, like these have been things that have been taught for so long,
Right.
that, like I said, it's in the subconscious, right? So like now it's something that I think people have started to believe is what should be the norm.
Well,
Especially because, like, if you think about it, it started in the mid-30s.
right.
That's almost 100 years ago.
And there's this concept that gets tossed around a bit of like the male gaze, GAZE, right? Like the idea that, and they'll also say the female gaze, right? Like what men and women are trained to seek out, or to prioritize in their worldview is kind of what that means, right? And you'll hear it talked about in literature and art, the idea that there is a particular way that men in our society, Western society, are trained to see the world, right?
Yeah.
And that vision is influenced. I almost imagine like if you are if you're an expert craftsman, right? You're going to look at a piece of wood and notice things that are very, very different than somebody who's never picked up a hammer will, right?
Sure.
You're trained to notice certain nuances, right? You opening up a beehive and looking at it is very different from someone who's never gotten close to a bee.
Yeah.
There's context on that if you don't know. Stephen keeps bees. Anyway, so
It's my email.
yeah. So we train our outlook to notice the details that we are told are pertinent to us.
Yep.
And if you think about the influences that have mostly targeted men in the 20th century and now in the present day, a lot of those influences have been hypersexualized women, always slightly out of reach, or so close to you that they are comfortably familiar but almost too familiar to be your partner. Anyway, we're kind of rehashing the same thing. There's this idea that like these are setting standards that potential partners can't compete with.
Yeah.
Like your typical girl that you go to church with, talking to our single guys out there, the girl that you go to church with who's in your age group is not going to be able to compete with a Betty Cooper.
Yeah.
Right. Or her more modern iterations of insert whatever comic universe Supergirl. Right.
Yeah. The funny thing is I can imagine someone listening to this saying, how can this short amount of time affect like the way people think as a society, right? But I watched a clip the other day that explained the power of innovation.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it was, what was his name? Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh yeah.
But he explained that in 20 years, basically, was that one generation, two generations?
I don't really know how.
Yeah.
I don't exactly know how generations are like calculated.
I think it's every 10 years.
No, it's not quite that clean.
Is
no.
it? Anyways.
Yeah.
He says, and basically in 20 years, you're talking about thousands of years of people using one type of form of transportation, a horse.
Yeah.
Everyone needed a horse. Every family had to have a horse. If you didn't have a horse, you had a very difficult time surviving.
Yeah.
Whether it was for farming, whether it was for travel, whether it was you're a tradesman,
Right.
whatever, or a woman, whatever it was, you had to have a horse. And they showed a photo from I think it was 1908 to 1928. And in 1908, I think there was it was the same photo taken 20 years apart, and they had 3 automobiles and 200 horses in this photo.
Yeah.
And 20 years later, the same exact spot, there was not a single horse there, and everyone had a car.
Yeah.
So 4,000 plus years of using horses as transportation got replaced in 20 years. So
Right.
when you have something that is that powerful and that influential, it can change in a moment and it can affect the whole society.
Yeah.
So when you have something that's sweeping the nation, it doesn't matter it's not about how short of time it is, how it affects people.
And the intensity of this time period, we don't have time to go into all this. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but this time period that we're talking about where comics sort of come in, like this whole range of sort of female archetypes is born, is between roughly 1930, right? And I guess I'm gonna go just 1930 to 1950 because that's kind of the golden age, right? Where there's a lot of Americana comic books sort of established. One of the most turbulent periods in history for Western men, right? Who are going to, in the course of the generations that move through those time periods, see war, right? If we extend it to the early 1900s, they're going to see 2 world wars, which is insane. They're going to see the Great Depression coming through after the 20s. They're going to see widespread social change as women step into the workforce and then are effectively moved out of it when men return from war after World War II. And the whole dynamic of the family is going to change. Expectations for career is going to change. In this very, very short period of time, we chew up and spit out what it means to be a masculine American man.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, you know what also came out during that time period?
Huh.
In the mid 30s, I think it was 37, Snow White came out.
Oh, Disney.
Yeah, and then I think it was 41.
Yeah, Cinderella came out in 1950.
And,
wow, that's wild.
And Sleeping Beauty when was that?
Sleeping Beauty was 1959. Snow White was 1937.
Yeah, okay, so 1937, 1950, 1957 were these like iconic princess romance like movies.
Yeah.
Isn't it crazy that Snow White came out in 37?
That is nuts. But it makes sense. So all these different influences are emerging and gaining traction with the advent of American marketing and media at this time too, like they never had before, right? So we can push these images and these archetypes out. We can mass produce them and market them more heavily than we ever have. And things like superheroes are going to become part of advertising. They're going to become part of clothing. They're going to become part of every aspect of American life is going to become infiltrated by these images of masculinity and femininity that are showing up in this time period.
Yep.
And we are living, whether or not you are a Disney person or a Marvel person or whatever, we are living in a society that has been shaped by that.
Yeah.
And our views of each other have been shaped by that. So anyway, backing back out of all the weeds of like all this history and like whatever, this isn't me telling anyone to throw out their idea of wanting someone who is, the girl next door because they're looking for someone who's familiar to them and who's comfortable and who doesn't insist on them changing themselves. I think there's a lot to say for that, right? You don't want to be with someone who wants to transform you.
Yeah.
But it's another one of these things where it's like we take these ideals at face value and we don't interrogate where they come from.
Yeah.
And they're not wholly ideals.
Yeah. All we really want to encourage you is to ask, where is your why coming from?
Yeah.
Like, why do you want a certain type? I love that quote that you said. I love that thing that you said in your reel. Can you say that again?
Yeah. We put up a post basically, and the idea is like, hold on, I'm looking it up because I can't remember what I put there. Oh, we asked, what if your type is actually just the collection of unhealthy traits that feel familiar to you?
Yeah, because that's huge. Because a lot of us say, oh, that's not my type. It's not my type. It's not my type. And I saw a comment say, oftentimes your type, like there's women and men that we know that go back and forth into abusive relationships because they keep on going back to their type of person.
Right. If you're a woman who really is into the idea of transforming a man from a monster, that's never going to go well.
No.
Right. In real life.
No. Without Jesus being involved.
Jesus has to be the one actually doing the transforming.
Yeah.
Because when it's like women, we don't have the capacity to change hearts and minds.
I should have wore a comic book shirt today.
That would have been weirdly appropriate. We're kind of giving the whole Americana sort of vibe here.
Captain America.
Yeah. You look a little Clark Kenty with your glasses.
There you go. I have just like his physique too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. So I think that this is just another, basically I want people to understand too that the marketing of unhealthy relationship ideals has not left men out, right? Men have been getting a version of this. I think it's a little bit more subtle because it's not packaged as romance, right? Men's influences about what to expect from women's bodies and from partnership with women, friendship and relationship with women, the influences are very different, and they're not marketed as here's the thing to read to learn about a romantic relationship, but the influences remain.
Yeah.
And they're not healthy. So it's just something that we need to be interrogating and going okay, what can I take from this? That's fine. Right. What can I appreciate about these icons of American art and history?
Yeah.
And what should I sort of leave out of my perspective of who's a healthy partner for me?
Yeah.
Yeah. This has been fun.
Yep, it has been. It's been nice to record in the middle of the day.
Yeah, it's been good.
And go to sleep at a relatively decent time.
Yeah. And not be super over caffeinated at midnight,
that is also true.
This is nice. We're learning. We're growing.
Let's not go that far.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to say about comic stuff? Girls Next Door?
I still love comics.
Yeah. I don't want to, I'm not here to ruin comics for anyone.
But understanding where it came from, and like, it's understanding that fantasy is fantasy, and recognizing that fantasy is okay to read as long as you don't put it before God.
Right.
And two, it's also, you have to recognize that that's not true to life.
If you put it before God, I'll also asterisk. And if your pastor is okay with it, and if your personal convictions are not offended by it.
Yeah. But it's one of those things, it's like, when you don't have checks and balances in place to understand, like, I don't say that, I mean, like, not everyone was raised in church. And it's like, going back to the whole Playboy thing, I had friends who were 9 who were their older brother had boxes of Playboy in their garage. Like, crazy. And it's like, that was normal to him. Right. I knew it was wrong, and I obviously chose not to go and hang out in his garage. Right. But it was one of those things, is like, some people, that's their normal. Right. And so when your mind is being developed and you're learning concepts that aren't being, and you're not being told what should be done correctly, right, and how to have healthy, godly relationships. But again, I think it's even more important with this concept that we have good influences in our kids' lives, talking about how to date like an apostolic, date like a Christian, date like the Bible says we should date. Right. Because all you have is media and the people and your friends around you at school to tell you what should be done the right way.
And voices to help you discern truth from fiction.
Yeah, I think we've been in limbo for so long, say we as Big C Church, that the church is hoping that parents are talking about it, and parents are hoping the church is talking about it. Right. And at the end of the day, the kid's getting neglected. Right. Me being included, and you included.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I think part of this is just helping our kids have voices that say, like, hey, it's fine to engage in some of these things if they're not unhealthy, but this isn't real, right? No. This isn't what women and men actually look like. This isn't how they actually act. Yeah. These are fiction, right? And it's ultimately not what you want, you know?
And I do want to caveat that I know that there are churches out there that are doing their part in trying to educate the younger generation how to date well. Yeah. But for the most part, from what we're hearing, it's not very common.
Yeah. I think it's just a place where we have room to improve. Yeah. So anyway, to my guys out there, I hope that this has been interesting and not offensive. I was a little worried about stepping on people's toes or making them feel like
I was worried about, like, all the guys turning it off and be like, oh, they hate comic books, I'm never listening to them again.
No,
that's not true.
We don't. We're nerds.
Yeah.
We're nerds. But I'm interested in your thoughts. So if you agree with this whole idea about the impact of these influences, I'd love to know what your thoughts are. Please drop a comment on the YouTube video or anywhere else where you follow us, because we want to hear more about it.
And if you want to send us an email or something and tell us that we were completely wrong, please do.
Yeah, there's an email address in the description.
That's right.
A couple of other quick announcements. Once again, keep an eye out for the sale coming up at the end of this month, the 23rd to the 26th specifically.
Of May,
thank you. Also, if you are going to the Draw Conference, that's DRAW, I think it's actually happening on the same weekend. We will have sync pins there available for you to pick up. So that is at it's in Detroit. So if you're in the Detroit area, check them out on social media. I think we've also put a link down there so you can go find them. And that will be a great place for you to look. Also, please remember that we are still booking for Singles at Sea.
Woo!
Woohoo! That's coming up in February, so you still have
February of 2026.
February of 2026. You still have plenty of time if you want to start making like monthly payments toward that and kind of working your way up to that total amount. All you have to do to get secured pricing is to call Chelsea or reach out to her, and her information is in the description as well. She's our travel coordinator. She'll let you know what the current prices are and kind of set you up with different, structures and talk you through the different cabin types and all that. But as a reminder, to reserve a cabin, it's $200 for a cabin. And that means that if you can travel with a friend and you both want to go together, you only need to put down $100 a piece. Yep. So all that information's in the description as well.
And if you need a cabin mate of the same gender, we can pair you up with one if you can't find one to bring with you.
You can come to the Singles,
but the Facebook page.
Right. You can come to the Singles at Sea Facebook page and we'll help you, touch base with someone else who could room with you.
Yep.
think that's all of our announcements.
I think so.
I love you.
I love you too.
Thank you for listening to me rant last night about comics very late.
Anytime. I was also eating, so it was easier.
Okay, good. All right, guys. Have a wonderful week.
Bye.
Bye.